My final guest works to dismantle redlining with green infrastructure. Debra Gore-Mann is the president and CEO of the Greenlining Institute. She's here to weigh in on how to inclusively approach the new infrastructure plan. Debra, it's great to see you again. And look, I know what redlining is, and I have talked with you before. I know what greenlining. I want you to paint the picture of the world you're trying to fix for our audience.
Thank you again, Steve, for inviting me and the Greenlining Institute. Well, so, redlining is sort of this historical pattern and systems and behaviors of excluding people of color from opportunity, both economic and health. And so we really have centered since, almost 30 years, how to create an equitable environment and community for communities of color. So, we center race because if you disaggregate the information, you will find that race is so pivotal to how this country has advanced its economic and climate opportunities for this country. And so, and just so to clarify, so racial equity as we define it is transforming the behaviors, the institutions and the systems to ensure that communities of color can reach their full potential. So that's the lens we bring, and we believe that it's essential to building the country that we see, that everybody else sees as well.
That's a beautiful depiction, and I think it really captures, the fact that, this is not only changes in physical landscape, which you can see, this is emotional, this is political, this is economic, across many different planes and dimensions. So I want folks to understand what now is responding, and we have an opportunity, a lot of money, we've been talking about it, a lot of opportunity to rewire, redo, and frankly fix errors of the past, but also to look towards the future. What are you now advocating in greenlining? Tell us some of the initiatives that you have conceptualized.
Well, if you historically, right, if you now take, I know you've had the last speakers talk about both the digital divide, broadband access, vehicle electrification, grid, all of those, if you take the access and the opportunities that communities of color have, you can actually lay those on top of the same redline segregated communities that were established in the 1930s and 1940s. So I think it was your guest, Mr. Erickson said, if we are doing things that replicate what our grandparents had, then we're doing it wrong. And in fact, the broadband and the infrastructure that we seek now with the bipartisan infrastructure bill cannot repeat those same bad practices, right? That we would be replicating what our grandparents did, and we would continue to preclude communities of color to participate. So when we are looking at these, $65 billion for infrastructure, for broadband, we are looking to make sure that it has an equitable lens, right? That the framework is centering those who are most impacted and those who need access. So for, broadband in particular, you could see that, Latino households have 1/3 the access that white households had. So the solutions and the way to invest should be inclusive of closing that gap. Right. So the way that you approach things is that everyone has access, not to repeat what we've already done. So then you will continue to have this problem of lack of access. And I love the story that the Representative Upton shared that, when the pandemic hit and they had to go home for broadband, well, that is tenfold in our communities of color, right? That they don't have access, that the middle mile and that the last mile to our rural communities tend to really exclude people of color. So when we look at the frameworks, we are working with the DOE, Department of Energy, and the Department of Transportation to make sure that they are centering equity so that we don't make those mistakes. Does that make sense? That the investment in fact, the way that the grants are issued or the investments are allocated, because it's decentralized to the states, to make sure that we do not perpetuate the same problems that got us here.
Debra, let me ask you, I'm not sure I'm going to get this right, but one of the things I've been thinking about through this whole program today, and it kind of goes back to when Brian Hendricks and I were discussing, what would the world look like in the future, which you just referenced. And in part, it's to basically fill the missing planks for parts of communities in America that were purposely left off the grid and did not benefit. So that's one element. But another part is that if we were to kind of freeze everything and sort of take, okay, the 90% of other society that did benefit was connected, still there is going to be massive investment in smart roads, smart water systems, smarter transportation systems, local public transport, as we were discussing, with the administrator from the transit, and that in part may touch the communities who are left behind. I'm just interested there's going to be a major retrofit of everything, and so if we were to say, okay, here's door A in which things gone really well in this massive retrofit, here's door B where things didn't go well, what are going to be the defining characteristics between those two as we're looking not just at connecting communities that we lost track of, but also everyone? What do we need to get right with that other 90%?
Yeah, I think there are the four pillars at this moment that if we do it right now, it's sort of a down payment, because even though as massive as this infrastructure bill is, there's definitely not enough. I mean, we want to, for sure, reduce emissions and across everything, right? We're just talking about reducing emissions. We want to emphasize clean energy, livable wages in those solutions. That will create a bit of equity. We're looking for domestic competitiveness, for sure. And I think that speaks to all of our communities and allowing communities to participate in that. And I think lastly, the most important is that there's energy justice for all of our communities. If you're doing those four things and you're focused on energy justice, you're going to create a better 100%. And I would argue we're not even at 90%, so forgive me, Steve. I would argue that we're much lower than that. But if you at least have those four pillars, you're going to create a different, I think, a more equitable and just economy and ability for all communities to participate.
Thank you. Debra, I want to ask you something personal, and we hadn't talked about planning this, but if my notes are right, and I didn't know this before when we talked before, that you were, you graduated with an engineering degree and an MBA from Stanford, where you were the only African-American woman in class of 300 graduate students. Do we have a redlining problem in education? Do we have a redlining problem that needs to be recovered in these other institutions? And I'd just be interested in your insights in that, because what we're really talking about is not infrastructure. It's just opportunity. It's basically giving people a very different life. And I want to not just focus on the physical side of it, but there's an emotional dimension to social contract in this country. And when I read this, I just want to ask you, what's your view? Because honestly, I'm proud of you, embarrassed for higher education.
Well, I mean, thank you, Steve, for asking. I reconnected with my classmates right through the pandemic, and there were so many in my class who didn't even realize that I was the only Black woman in the class, that they were able to go through their educational experience without opening up their aperture to what the experience was like for others. And so in having those conversations, we've pulled together a racial justice group within the business school and have had a rich discussion about how did that happen, right? Like, I'm not a child of the 60s. I went to business school in the late 80s. And to be the only Black woman in the class was a bit of a burden. And so to say that there's a problem would sort of single out Stanford University. And I don't think that, that's the position I would take. They had accepted a large group of African-American women, and they chose to go elsewhere, right? So was there something in particular about this group and the ability to attract and retain and recruit that also folds in to the experience? And so I say in general, the access to education has been, debt-ridden. That restricts who makes what decision to go where. There's the opportunity to be in community with people who look and sound like you. So that also speaks to the faculty, the research work that's being done, right? There are a myriad of things that allowed me to pick Stanford that year where others did not. And those classmates who did have the awareness did create a very supportive environment for me. It also, in my background, I was a Division I athlete, and so being athletic, I was able to bond with many of the men in my class because we'd go play ball together, right? And one of them is a partner at a venture capital firm, and we all stay in touch. So there are different ways to make connections, but it is a burden to communities of color to be able to afford, to have all the qualifications, but then to be able to afford that opportunity, both in how you fund it. I don't have parents who have multi-generational wealth from owning a house. We get into affordable housing and how that affects the wealth gap. But I have that lived experience of being one of the only, and then to want to represent the community and to do that in a way that's, that the community can respect and be proud of. So. And to bring it full circle, I feel like that's the work that I'm doing at Greenlining, right? That we unapologetically center racial equity as a way to transform this country in a time when we are having an awakening. And I know you've used the term that we are maybe renovating, but I think we are actually in a reconstruction period, that we are reconstructing both the social fabric, the infrastructure fabric, the political climate of this country, much as they did right after the Civil War. So anyways, thank you for that question and giving me an opportunity.
I love talking to you. I hope we
can.
I love talking to you. I hope we can have you back many times. Because one of the other dimensions which we have to go into another day is as we reconnect or reconstruct and rebuild and look at social contract. A guy named Arno Penzias made a very provocative statement years ago and said, the internet is going to make smart people smarter and dumb people dumber. It's not necessarily going to solve problems. But I'm wondering if that's true in this case, whether we're at an inflection point that actually beginning to create an inclusive, fully inclusive connection can help solve the deficits of trust in some of these communities. I don't know the answer to that. I'd love to get your answer, but maybe another, unless you want to give us a 30-second hit on that.
Well, no, we really do believe in both. And let me just say at Greenlining, we do our work through coalition and communities, right? That we do it locally. It's the idea of targeted universalism. Like we have a universal goal and we're ambitious, but we do it targeted by what each community needs. And so I would argue that if we can have an eye on that and a lens on that, then we can create a more just economy and a more just country. So I would hope, that equity now is more embraced. And in the nomenclature, I would say, the way I think about racial equity, when like somebody says, I'm maximizing shareholder wealth, like that term, and it's a business term and people achieve it. And using racial equity should have that same sort of response. That is something we just do. It's achievable. It's, it's sort of fused into the way of American life. So anyways, absolutely. You should put on another sort of convening.
We will. I promise we will.
Absolutely.
Well, Debra Gore-Mann, President and CEO of the Greenlining Institute, I love speaking to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Well, that brings us to the end of our program. A really big thank you to Nokia for its support of these great conversations and to all of you attendees for joining us this discussion. For any of you who missed this today, we're going to have the video up from the event up on our website shortly. I'm Steve Clemons. Thank you and be well.